a couple people already said to me, well, I really learn better when I'm standing, but I didn't want to stand up because I didn't want to bother you. Hello, I'm not visual. I won't even see you. You make a lot of noise, I'll hear you, but I won't see you, so do that. All right, brain benders. Anybody here who has not done these yet? Good. Oh, a couple, 3. All right, well, here we go. Each little box is a puzzle. They're whole-brained. With your left hemisphere, you can read the letters and the words. It doesn't matter so much how it's spelled, it's how does it sound in your brain. And with your right hemisphere, you're looking at where the position of the word is in the box or in relation to each other, and then you just come up with a little phrase. And these are age-proofing brain aerobic exercises. And you can go to my website, and there's hundreds of them there. You can get you 30 minutes of challenging mental exercise every day off my website for months, free of charge. Okay, top left, word in a word. Dyed in the wool, good. Second on the left. Slightly overcast, third on the left, word in a word. Shot in the dark, fourth on the left. Good, top right. Tree in the middle of the street, second on the right. Never on Sunday, third on the right. Fourth on the right. Do you remember last night when we did the first section? And it took us a considerable length of time to get through that. Look how fast you did these. Another layer of asphalt on your brain highways. It's amazing. All right, we're talking about something called sensory preference. This is what I call the who I am pyramid. These are the top 5 things that I believe that everybody needs to know about him or herself, so that you understand more about your brain function. And so you can see on the bottom, it's whether you have an empathizing, a systemizing, or a 50-50 brain. And in our culture, empathizing is associated with what we call the female brain, and systemizing is associated with what we call the male brain. And the 50-50 brain is really a brain that's half and half, and usually so is the body. The body will have 1 testicle and 1 ovary. And the brain will be 50-50. And of course, you always get something when you give something up, and you always give something up to get something. So these 50-50 brains, they can communicate equally well with an empathizing brain or a systemizing brain. And we don't know how many of these are on the planet. There's some estimates that it's between 1% and 2%. And often you don't know that, because they have, chosen one way or another way to dress. And you're not going to walk up to somebody and say, have you got an ovary and a testicle, or have you got 2 of each? So you're not going to know that, but that's the 50-50 brain. Then I had to put a new layer in here last year, because now we're getting research about East brains or West brains and how different they are in structure and function. If you were born and raised in the eastern part of our world, especially the Asian part, your brains are different than people who are born and raised on the western side of the planet. And it's not good or bad, right or wrong, it's different. And there's some belief that if you want to have a whole brain decision, you'd need people representing all of these at the table, because everybody brings a slightly different perspective. And then, are you an extrovert, an ambivert, or an introvert? Which makes a big difference when you look at the environment and take in data. Then we go to sensory preference, and then at the top is brain bent. And I've got maybe a dozen books that after the last session I'll have available. One of them is Your Brain Has a Bent, Not a Dent. And it talks about some of this. So we're talking about sensory preference now. So we relate to each other through the senses, and I don't know any other way that we relate to another human being. If you can figure out another way, you probably become an instant millionaire, because it would be new. Don't know of any other way we relate except through the senses. And we, growing up, we talked about, your nose and your ears and your eyes and your mouth and your hands and tasting and smelling and hearing and so on. But we usually group them into three main systems, and you already know that. Visual, what you take in through sight. Auditory, what you take in through sound. And kinesthetic, what you take in through smell and taste and touch and muscle position and so on. Bottom line for you male brains, people feel most comfortable, accepted, affirmed when they're communicated with in their own sensory system. And we're different. And one of the values of trying to figure out who's who is how to communicate with them in a way that will make quick sense to their brain, if you will. And we'll talk about that. So unimpaired, well, we're all impaired, but relatively unimpaired. We use all the sensory systems. I mean, I have eyes and I see that you're out there, but it's the least way I pick up data. I really don't see the minutia. And the auditories, and I am clearly auditory. I am really tuned into sound. And my brother's kinesthetic. I'm not. That's my second sensory system. But I'll tell you right up front, I think it's toughest on this planet for kinesthetics. Because what do we really emphasize in our culture primarily? How things look, absolutely. And secondly, most churches and most schools, what sensory system are they emphasizing? Auditory. You either read it or you shut up and listen. And so the kinesthetics are sort of out there somewhere. And these pews are padded. Any of you who are kinesthetic, such a deal for you. Because they aren't always padded. And it can be really difficult for a kinesthetic to sit on something that isn't padded or even sit at all. So all you kinesthetics probably would be doing better if you were standing anyway. So by kindergarten age, you can be pretty much picking up what their sensory preference is. There's controversy about whether it's learned or innate. My brain's opinion is it's definitely innate. But that the first 5 years of life is such a steep learning curve that they're learning through all the senses, and you don't pick it up like you do after about kindergarten age. But some of the studies have done scans of the fetus during pregnancy, and the fetus will be sucking its thumb or a finger, and in those that have been tracked, they always turned out to be kinesthetic. It was comfortable to suck on their finger or their thumb. And sometimes you can pick it up in the nursery. Women, nurses, male or female, who've worked in the nursery, say the little kinesthetic babies, 3 hours old, if the blankets have a satin edge on them, they'll often see those little babies just lying there and touching with their little teeny fingers the satin smooth edge. And they don't see that with visuals and auditories. So here's the cutaway of the brain again, and here's those 4 chunks. My face is a clock, just to remind you from high school biology. 2 occipital lobes, where you take in information through sight. 2 temporal lobes. Remember that for the next section when we talk about how differently males process sound. And 2 parietal lobes here where you do pretty much everything else: temperature perception, muscle control, taste, touch. The sense of smell is in that middle mammalian layer, so it doesn't show up here. So here's the population estimates, just for fun. Large sample studies, 60% of the population are visual. So that should be no surprise, the reason that visualness is so emphasized in our culture. And when you cut that by gender, far more males are visual than females. 20% are auditory, and when you cut that by gender, more females are auditory. There are a few males who are auditory, but they're like hen's teeth. And 20% of the population are kinesthetic, and I've never seen any difference in population studies about males and females. Now, kinesthetic is about touch and taste and smell and perception of muscles and temperature and so on. Avoid mistaking that with every human being has skin hunger needs, meaning we were made to touch and be touched. And wonderful research about babies in orphanages who died. And then somebody, another Galileo type, said, I wonder if they're getting enough touch. Touch? What are you talking about? And so they recruited elderly people from the community to come in and hold the babies 15 minutes a day. That's all they got. And guess what? They stopped dying. Everybody has skin hunger needs. That's a little different from being kinesthetic, although kinesthetics might be more sensitive to touch than others. I remember one time I was presenting this in a university setting, and someone came up to me and said, well, I just need to know who the kinesthetics are, and then I will make sure that I touch them. And I went, hold it. Yes, they're very sensitive to touch. They are also the most discriminating about who touches them. So if I think somebody's kinesthetic, I'm not going to touch them unless I ask them. Just remember that, because we mistake what that means sometimes. So, a couple caveats. You tend to relate to others in your sensory preference unless you realize maybe theirs is different and you make a different choice. So for me, I could stand up here with my eyes closed and talk for a solid week. Not a problem. But I know that I'm only 20% of the population, so I got to always have something for the visuals to look at and hope and pray that the chairs are padded for the kinesthetics. You tend to feel accepted and loved most quickly when you get affirmation, communication in your sensory preference. What does that mean? We even use different words based on our sensory preference. I'll talk about how things sound. Visuals talk about how things look. Kinesthetics talk about how things feel. And if you listen, you can pick up somebody's sensory preference just by listening to how they talk. And finally, we gravitate toward environments that make provision for our sensory preference. So when kids don't want to go somewhere, or they don't even want to go back home after they've left home often, my first thing is, wonder if their sensory preference differed from that of their parents. And they don't really feel comfortable there because there's nothing in the environment that makes them feel okay about themselves. And we'll talk about that. It starts early. I lean toward introversion. I'm an ambivert, but I'm smashed right up against the introversion line. So I only was a camp nurse one summer. Amazing, I survived. So I show up, early in June, and I'm going to be the camp nurse. First group is like 200 7- and 8-year-olds. Walked into the cafeteria room, and somebody had a bright idea. They said, this is the very first night, and, we'd just be better if we plated all the food in the kitchen, brought it out to all the kids, and tomorrow morning they can learn to go through line. So I walk in, 200 kids sitting on benches, and I hear somebody crying. Auditory, right? So I make my way toward the sound, and here's this cute little boy, freckles, red hair sticking up, just sobbing on the table. So I sat down and I said, hi, my name's Arlene. I'm the camp nurse. Obviously, something's bothering you. Can I help you? He goes, I can't eat my food. I said, is there something on your plate that you don't like? No, I just can't eat it. I said, well, help me understand that, and maybe we can solve the problem. He goes, well, look. And he's still got his head on the table. I'm looking. I don't see anything wrong with it. I'm not visual, right? I mean, I see the plate, I see some food. And I said to him, you know what? I'm not visual. I use the language whether they know what that means or not. I said, I'm not visual. Help me explain what the problem is with the food on your plate. At which point he sits up, tear-streaked face, and he goes, well, look. I said, I'm looking. Well, he says, the beets have run into the mashed potatoes, and I can't eat pink mashed potatoes. I wouldn't have noticed. So I said to him, okay, hold everything. So I go back to the kitchen. I said to the cook, this is sloppily plated for a visual. And I explained what was happening. She goes, oh, for heaven's sake, they're not going to taste any different. I said, that's not the problem. It'll never get to his mouth if you can't give him plain potatoes that aren't pink. So she plates another plate of food, and I carefully set it down, and nothing's run together. He looks at it, he goes, oh, I can eat that. And we treat all kids the same, and they're not the same. And that was just one of the children. Saw several others that were having different kinds of problems. So I think that I didn't get the sensory preference assessment to the church on time. I got here on time, but it didn't get here on time. So you can go to my website, and you'll see on the main menu something that says assessments. Click on it, and up will pop a sensory preference assessment. And you can take that, and you can get some clear idea of what your sensory preference is, because if you don't know yours, then you won't be able to recognize when other people are the same or different. And you will just add up the scores for each of the 3 columns, and that will give you some sense of what your preference is. Now, my scores, just for information, I am a 20 out of 21 on the auditory score, and I'm telling you, this church has magnificent human beings back in the control booth. I have not squawked or squeaked or gone dead or anything, and that's really important to an auditory. That's fabulous. Yes, by all means, clap for them. They often don't get much recognition. Somebody only talks to them if they don't like something. Well, I'm telling you, they're good at what they do. Visually is my least score. That's 7 out of 21. My mother was visual. Oh dear. I never met her need for visualness. And kinesthetic, I'm 11. So it's 7, 11, and 20. So auditory, of course, is the easiest one for me. Figure it out, and then give the assessment to people in your family, give it to the kids in your classroom. Try to help them figure out what their preference is, because it makes a difference how they learn and how they relate to the environment. When I did this, the estimates of distribution, I was lecturing back east. And I mentioned that 60% of males, 60% of people were visual and more males were visual. And there's this couple sitting on the front of the auditorium. And she elbows her husband, and he grunted. So I heard that, and I looked at them. And she goes in this sotto voice. She goes, well, Harry, I finally get it. Okay, I'm curious. I would never do that now. That was way back in my early days of lecturing. But I said, obviously you've had an aha moment. Would you like to come up and share with us what you learned? She hops up, runs up on the platform, grabs my microphone. So what do I know for sure right off the bat? She's extroverted. And this is what she says. Harry and me have been married for 35 years. This is the first time I understood the reason he always wants to do it with lights on and mirrors on the ceiling. I don't ask anymore. But I'm really glad she got it, because obviously that was a bone of some kind of contention between them. All right. So, people who are visual are different from people. Oh, have we got some sensory preference assessments? Fabulous. All right, avoid doing them now. Listen and do them later, but thank you very much for finding them. Good man. All right, and you can print them off from my website, as many as you want. I just don't sell them. So people who are visual, when they are exposed to auditory, visual, and kinesthetic data, what registers fastest in their brain is what they see. That is different from the ability to visualize. Remember that. Visualization, the ability to look at internal mental pictures in your mind's eye, everybody can do that. That's the ability to pull up in your mind a picture of something you've seen. Like if I say to you, pull up in your brain a picture of the woman who was your mother figure growing up. You got that picture popped up in your brain? Your search engine should find it in an instant. And there goes that picture. And sometimes people have to teach themselves to look at it and really see it, but it's there. Or if I say to you, pull up a picture in your brain of an elephant that you have seen. Okay, there's a picture. Now if I say, instead of the elephant being gray, why don't you paint some black tiger stripes on that elephant? Okay, your brain is able to do that. Can you see that? An elephant now with tiger stripes on it? Okay, that's just what visualizing means. So it's different from responding to visual stimuli most quickly. Sometimes people who are visual literally hold their breath while they're talking because they're looking at the pictures in their mind, recalling what they've seen and getting ready to describe it to you. And so they just have a moment of silence there. This is how you can tell they tend to use visual words and metaphors. So listen to what they say. I see what you mean. The light just went on. It was crystal clear to me. Do you see how they're speaking in things that have to do with vision? They'll use metaphors that are visual. She talked till she was blue in the face. An auditory or a kinesthetic won't say that. And they often draw big pictures in the air as they're trying to explain to you what it is they're seeing. Appearance is really important to them. They're very aware of how they look, how other things look. It can be really hard on a little visual child whose life circumstances are not very economically flush, and they're wearing only cast-off clothing or mended clothing. It can be very hard on them because visual is so important. I learned that with a set of twins. See, I'm not visual. Oh, I have a set of, I have friends who have a set of twins. When this happened, they were probably about 9, loved me to death. It's really hard not to love somebody who thinks you're wonderful. So I would stop and visit them when I was in their town. This particular day, I knocked at the door. The little boy ran to the door, answered the door, and he goes, Arlene, come in. Throws his arms around me. Okay, so what is his probable sensory preference? Kinesthetic, and he feels safe, so he's touching me. I looked around, he says, where's your sister? Because she's usually there too. He goes, she's locked in her bedroom. I said, really? Who locked her in her room? She did. I said, well, what's the problem? He says, I'm not really sure, but she's locked in her room and won't come out. I said, okay, let's go talk to her. So we go through the house, down the hall. I knock on the door. I said, it's Arlene. Come out and visit. Sob, sob, sob. So I said, well, honey, what's the problem? Oh, she said, my mother gave me a permanent yesterday and it frizzed my hair and I can't come out. So what is she probably? Visual. It didn't help that her kinesthetic little brother says in this big loud voice, "And really, Arlene, doesn't look any different to me." And it probably didn't. More sobs. She finally came out. I don't notice much difference, but it was huge for her. They tend to feel affirmed when they see pleasant visual things. They see smiling faces. They see coordinated colors. They see themselves dressed in a way that they look good. That really affirms them. And they learn most quickly by watching, seeing somebody do something. And the reason you aren't working? I didn't see you coming. I would not see them coming. I would hear them, maybe. Cream rinse in the old water hole again, I see. What percentage about are people in terms of visualness? 60, good. So now you come to auditory, and I'm clearly an auditory. Obviously, I don't even know I'm stepping on something that's hard. Responding to sound, period. Sound gets my attention really, really quickly. And I prefer to get my information through sound or through reading, because reading or hearing are decoded in the same part of the brain. And often it's auditories who take notes. Not always. Sometimes it's a kinesthetic, and the motion of writing helps them stay awake, the movement. But sometimes auditories do best taking notes. They use auditory words. They don't talk about, "Oh, I see what you mean." They say, "Oh, that sounds okay. I hear what you're saying." Clear as a bell. Not I see it clearly, but clear as a bell in sound. Irritating as a dripping faucet kind of thing. And sometimes they sigh. It's an auditory characteristic that when they feel stressed, it is the sound of exhaling air that makes them feel better. So if you hear somebody sighing, it might mean they're auditory. Sensitive to environmental sounds. At the camp, some kids were crying the night we had haystacks because they didn't like the sound of crunching the chips in their mouths. And some kids loved the sound of crunching chips in their mouth. I personally don't want to wear anything that makes any sound. I don't want, zippers, and I don't want things flopping around on my shoes, and I don't want my watch on a chain. I remember probably when I was about 14 or 15, the new nylon fabric came out that they made, ski suits and stuff out of. Well, my mother bought me a pair. Until I finally found a way to get rid of them. I was walking like this all the time because I couldn't stand the sound of the swish of the material, and she thought I was just losing it. Tend to feel affirmed with positive sounds. People talking in a pleasant way. I loved the music this morning. That's very affirming to an auditory, especially someone who's studied music. I like to get emails from people, especially those who I've met, because I hear in my brain the sound of the voice of the person who wrote the email. And some of you do the same thing. Others of you do not at all. Must be an auditory. Every leaf's been talked off my tree. So we all have, I was going to say strengths and weaknesses, but I don't really mean that. We all have characteristics based on sensory preference, and auditories are usually so comfortable with talking that they've got to be careful that they listen as well. And they can be really good listeners, but talking is just so easy for them that it's easy to over-talk. Pardon me, have we met? Right side of the brain remembers faces, but A visual is more likely to remember a face. You know, I can usually have some sense if I've seen a face before, but you know, some auditories really have difficulty. So kinesthetic, they really respond to what's in the environment in terms of taste and touch and odors. In fact, they are the fastest to decode an odor, and if it's connected to any type of emotional experience in their past life, you know, they can be right. There's a rabbit out here. I saw it. Isn't that amazing? For an auditory to see a rabbit? And he's not making any noise. That's really amazing. Too cute. So for a kinesthetic, they can smell something and they've had an emotional event related to that odor, and the second they smell the odor, they're right back at the emotional event. And it'll trigger a memory faster than anything else. So I think it's sometimes a little bit more stressful for kinesthetics in our culture because we have such a huge emphasis on how things look. And it's not that kinesthetics don't want to look good, it's that they have to be comfortable. They have to be comfortable. My brother is a kinesthetic. My mother is a visual. We didn't know about this growing up. So I was born in Calgary, 56 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. And then we moved to Winnipeg in Manitoba, which just got colder. And my mother, being a visual, did not want any moth holes in our clothes. So when we would come to our 3 days of summer, and she would pack up our winter clothes and put them away, she always put mothballs in them. Well, I had no idea, neither did she. Every fall she'd unpack these and my brother did not want to put the clothes on. And he'd cry, and he couldn't tell us the reason he didn't want to put them on. He just didn't want to put them on. And she'd make him put them on and go to school. And he was sick a lot, every single fall. 2, 3, 4 weeks, he'd cold after cold after cold. And then he'd get better and he'd be pretty well the rest of the year. In retrospect, I think as the clothes off-gassed and he no longer smelled the, you know, awful odor, then he didn't mind wearing the clothes. Okay, I made a huge error in judgment. When I get a new piece of information, I get really excited because it makes a lot of things make more sense. So several years ago, we got the clear research about how sensitive kinesthetics are to odors. And I was going down to his place for Thanksgiving dinner. And we're all sitting around the table. We got a lot of extended family there. And I don't even wait for anything. I just blurt out, "Oh, Alan, you really have to, I got to tell you about the new research." And he looks at me and he goes, before we've even said grace, I said, "Okay, pray, but make it short." And so I said, "We've got this wonderful new research about kinesthetics, and I think you're a kinesthetic." Well, he says, "What does that mean?" So I explained it. And he says, "Well, what makes you think I'm kinesthetic?" I said, "Well, here's the deal. Do you remember when you were a little boy back in Canada and you didn't want to put clothes on that Mom had unpacked from mothballs?" Big mistake. He puts down his fork and he goes, "Very good, sis. Way to ruin Thanksgiving dinner for me. All I can smell are mothballs." That's how strong it was, and he could still smell them in memory. So it's really important to pay attention. And they use kinesthetic words. They don't talk about, "I see clearly," or "I hear what you say." They say something like, "That doesn't feel right. You know, I got a gut feeling. Not a good fit for me. Let's hammer out a plan," you know, the kinesthetic metaphors. And surprisingly, they often have low-pitched voices, and one of the researchers described it as they speak slowly and their words flow out like thick cream. Is that not a kinesthetic metaphor? So listen to people who you think are kinesthetic and see how that goes. Now, they're very, very, very sensitive to touch. They discriminate quickly between sexual and non-sexual touch. And the years that I was compliance officer for Adventist Health, if an employee came to me and said, so-and-so is touching me sexually, and then now you go talk to the other employee and they go, I'm not touching them sexually, I just patted them. No, if the person's kinesthetic, they know the difference, and you got to pay attention to that. They learn most quickly by actually hands-on getting in there and doing it. Now, what do most schools emphasize? Which sensory system? Auditory. Not visual, auditory. What you read and what you listen to. And the visuals, can watch, but the kinesthetics need to do it. And there's often not a lot of opportunity for them to just get in and do it hands-on. So it can be really frustrating for them. When a family brings a child to me and says, our son was doing really, really well until we changed schools and got a new teacher. The first thing I want to know is, what's the child's sensory preference and what's the teacher's sensory preference? Because in all probability, there's not a match. I couldn't help it. First there was the smell, then I thought about the taste, and it was worth it to try to steal them. Cut the noise, will you? Even my hide is quaking. Now, you'd ordinarily think that would be an auditory, wouldn't you? And sometimes an auditory can be jarred by music hitting the skin, because that's your largest body organ. But boy, it's really true for a kinesthetic. Sometimes they have to get up and leave an environment because those sound waves beating against their skin is just very uncomfortable for them. And the only way they usually make it is if I send them back with earplugs. And they can dampen that down, and then even if it's beating on their skin, at least it's not so loud in their ears and they might make it. But it's very different for different brains. So think back, what sensory system was emphasized in your childhood home? It's always fun to go back and do some family of origin work for me. It's pretty clear. In my family, my mother was visual, probably 21 out of 21. I was the only auditory. My brother and my father were kinesthetic. This is where you need to be careful that your sensory preference doesn't run away with you. So this is sometimes what would happen. Be really cold of a morning. And my father would get up early, go down and put coal in the furnace and turn it on so that when we woke up 2 hours later, the house would be warm. Wonderful. I didn't appreciate that growing up. Man, I find out lots of kids' fathers never did that for them. And he always made hot cereal in the winter, so we would come out of our bedrooms to a warm house and hot cereal. Well, one day it was really cold. Jack Frost painted all the windows. And we came into the kitchen, and my father had on his warmest clothes. It's just that they didn't match. He had a plaid shirt, because it's his warmest shirt, and he had striped wool pants. So my mother comes out of the bedroom, and she's looking around. First thing she does is fasten on to my dad, and she goes, "What do you have on, Warren?" And he goes, "My warmest clothes." Well, she said, "You got a plaid shirt and a striped pair of pants. They don't match." So they don't match. She says, "I can't eat with you looking like that." So he goes into the bedroom and he changes his shirt so she can eat. And I'm sitting there even back then thinking, well, by the time he sits down, she's only going to see the top part anyway. What's the deal here, folks? Avoid letting your sensory preference run away with you. She could have easily just looked someplace else, but we didn't know that back then. So we talked a little bit about what system is emphasized in schools, clearly auditory. What's emphasized in society in general? Visual, absolutely. So you can think about your childhood home and your adulthood home, what sensory preferences emphasized. It's fun to go to American versus European churches. Lovely American churches. I mean, there's actually some stained glass in this one for the visuals. Both ends. There's obviously some pipes for the auditories. Loved the piano this morning. I don't think I heard the organ. Choir was fabulous. Padded pews for the kinesthetics. But most of the time, it's auditory, again, that's emphasized in most churches. Go over to Notre Dame. That's a taste for visuals. Who's been to Notre Dame? Okay, gold everywhere, beautiful statues everywhere, huge organ. I mean, it is a taste treat for visuals. It's also pretty good for auditories. Not a lot for kinesthetics. There's no air conditioning in Notre Dame. There's no heat in Notre Dame. There's a few little square chairs with the wicker kind of sunk in from decades of you know what. It's not much there for the kinesthetic, but there's wonderful things there for the visual. So now we come to America and we've got auditory and kinesthetic pretty well handled. And you've got some visual, this is great, but some churches don't. So what happens for the visuals? They want to go back to environments that works for their sensory preference. So sometimes we need to take a little bit better look at decor and so on. Now, when you take the sensory preference assessment, be really careful. The instructions say if one of these, read the statements, and any that apply to you 75% of the time or more, check that. Okay, pay attention to that. Because I've had people come hand me back a sensory preference assessment and everything's checked on all 3 columns. And I say 75% of the time? That can't be. So I send them back to redo it. So pay attention. Occasionally you will still come up with a tied score. And you will have some instructions so that'll tell you what that might mean. But sometimes it means that who you really are was not rewarded. And so you sort of pulled in your preference and developed skills in another preference so you could fit in another system so you could fit in. That's not really who you are. So it can be a fun journey to take that. And this is what I find for kinesthetics. If they were held down and tickled a lot growing up, if they had their hair pulled a lot, if they were spanked a lot, if they had bad smells in the house, maybe they were really stressed and wet the bed and it didn't smell good, they'll often pull in their sense of kinesthesia and their second sense will tie with it. So if people have tied scores and one of them's kinesthetic, they're usually kinesthetic innately. So were you yelled at or given the silent treatment in your auditory? That might give you tied scores. And did you grow up where there wasn't anything beautiful to look at? Not much color, clothes didn't match, maybe the best that your parents could do, but it was unattractive. And you might have pulled in your visualness. So what's the bottom line? We tend to relate to others in our sensory preference unless we realize they have a different sensory preference and we make a different choice. So start paying attention because people feel affirmed, loved, accepted, comfortable when their sensory preference is acknowledged, and you can do that to everyone. Not too long ago, I was called to a church in another state, fairly good-sized church, 2,500 members, And they asked me to come because they said there's been a survey done of the major churches in this city, and out of 26 churches, we're 26. And we'd like to move up on the list, and we don't know the reason we're 26. So I said, sure, I'll come. So Sunday morning, I walk in to the foyer, and I had not been in that church 3 minutes, and I could tell you the reason they were 26. There was somebody standing at the entrance with a handful of bulletins. And as my husband and I walked in, he's visual, I'm auditory. As we walk in, naturally, we walk toward the person who's got the bulletins. And this is what happened. They're looking at somebody else, handing a bulletin out. Okay, my husband's visual, that's not working for him. They don't say a word to me, I'm auditory. Okay, so I take the bulletin, I can read. But nobody said, hello, I see you're visiting. You know, obviously they didn't see I was visiting. If you're kinesthetic, nobody offered to shake their hand, and just shoving a piece of paper at a kinesthetic, you know, unless the paper is really nicely velvetized, is not going to be helpful. So I got them all together and I said, you know, you got 7 seconds when somebody walks into your church to help them feel comfortable. And the pastor goes, well, how do we do that? I said, well, first of all, you train all your greeters, all your receptionists, that every person that walks through the door, you're not going to know their sensory preference. Well, you might figure it out if somebody walks in and they just look like they stepped out of a magazine. But they don't know that, so you have to do something that will get all three, whatever their preference is, which means you look at them, because visuals like to be looked at. And you smile. And you say, welcome, I'm glad to see you today, in a nice voice tone, because auditories pick up on voice tone. And you offer to shake their hand, and it won't matter whether they're visual or auditory or kinesthetic, there's something there for them, and it will help them feel comfortable. So that didn't happen to me at this church, I'll tell you. People were all over me when I hit the door. You're new, aren't you? Well, good for you. I haven't been here before. Welcome. Here's the bulletin. Here, let me shake. Your pastor came out and put his arm around me. I nearly fainted. And I'm not even kinesthetic. So you got some things going for you here. Now think about your home, and how do you treat people who come to your home? Do they feel comfortable in their sensory preference? Have you got it? You're so fast. You're such a fast group. All right, time for a 10-minute break. Get up, move around, please. Get some oxygen to your brain, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about vision and hearing differences.